You are listening to the Foreign Policy Focus podcast.
We cannot wait for the final proof. The smoking gun could come in the form of a mushroom cloud.
Haven't you driven enough people from their homes already? Bulldoze their villages, seize their property under laws they had no part in making.
Now working in Libya with friends and allies, we've demonstrated what collective action can achieve in the 21st century.
Now the host of the show, Kyle Ansel.
Welcome to a swapcast of the Around the Empire podcast and the Foreign Policy Focus podcast with me, Joanne Leon, and Kyle Anzalone. Our guest today is Danny Sjursen, and we discuss Danny's experience on the ground at the protests in Kansas City and the broader protest movement, whether this is an insurrection, the idea of calling in the military to act as a police force or worse, and the parallels between current policing practices and counterinsurgency missions. Major Danny Sjursen is retired U.S. Army strategist, a West Point grad, a former history instructor at West Point. He served tours with reconnaissance units in Iraq and Afghanistan. He's the author of a memoir and critical analysis of the Iraq War titled Ghostriders of Baghdad, Soldiers, Civilians, and the Myth of the Surge, and a new book available for pre-order now titled Patriotic, Dissent, America in the Age of Endless War. His articles are published by numerous media outlets, antiwar.com, The American Conservative, Truthdig, TomDispatch, and others. And also he's the co-host of the great Fortress on a Hill podcast. We recorded this on June 5th, 2020. Welcome to another Swapcast, Around the Empire podcast, and with Kyle Anzalone from Foreign Policy Focus at the Libertarian Institute. And today, hi Kyle, how you doing?
Hi Joanne, great to be on. Thanks for having me.
And this time we have a guest with us, our friend Danny Sjursen. He's a retired major in the U.S. Army, speaking to us from Kansas. Now Danny's a veteran, amazingly prolific writer and speaker, and he has the verbal and writing skills of a New Yorker. And I would give you advice, don't get into verbal sparring with them unprepared, because they do it for sport and from a young age. And he has the experience of a soldier and an officer, perspective of an historian. He's got the passion of a dissident, and now the experience of living and raising children in the heartland. So you can see why we keep going back to him for insights. And he's been extremely generous with his time and his knowledge. And Danny, we thank you for that and for everything you do. And welcome back to the show.
Oh, well, thank you for having me. I'm genuinely flattered that you thought of me.
All right. So the article, we're going to talk about one main article. Danny's been on the ground in Kansas City in these protests. And we're going to talk about a Dispatch article that he wrote. And you can find all that linked in the show notes. And if we have time, we're going to actually refer back to a very prescient article he wrote almost a year ago. And so let's start with the dispatches from Kansas City, Danny. First of all, you mentioned this. Well, I'm just going to read a little bit here. You say, as a mid-level manager of imperial violence, I was regularly reminded that my words had meaning and consequences, however modest, by dint of my officer position. So went the ubiquitous rejoinder. Anything I said around my soldiers sent a message and set an example, whether intended or not. So count me curious why more Americans, even vague, small c conservatives, haven't concluded that President Trump's recent escalatory and inflammatory tweets disqualify him as commander-in-chief. Indeed, in such a moment, arguably the broader COVID one too, it's starkly apparent that the Donald's ignorance, insecurity, and wildly flawed character has become a public safety hazard. Now, you also go on to say, what makes it an insurrection? And you say, it's difficult to understand what's unfolding in America's streets that qualifies as a rebellion. And I'm really glad that you went there. I mean, all this is great. But that one particularly for me, and Kyle can tell you, I was actually thinking that this was kind of an insurrection or bordering on one. But I think I'm wrong about that. But it's also partly because I'm conflating it with 3 years of, what looked like attempts to take this president down, and and also I feel a certainty that it's going to escalate. And I guess worse, than you do touch on this in your article, that the organic, justified protests are being exploited by politicians, by the power elite, and that they're trying to create sort of self-fulfilling prophecies, these doom-laden prophecies that they've been saying about this president for more than 3 years. He's martial law, he's Stalin, and sort of their obsession to recreate Nixon and Watergate. So I realize I'm wrong about insurrection, but it's like anticipatory because of just the, I don't know, just the exaggeration that we've seen up to now. I guess I'm just afraid they're going to somehow make that happen. But I'm really glad that you put this in perspective about what is insurrection, and the really valuable thing that you add that few people can is having experience with young soldiers and anticipating what would happen if we put American soldiers on the streets in American cities. So that's kind of a long way of kind of telling you where my mind is with this, and Kyle can come in and talk about his perspective, because I think he disagreed with me that it was an insurrection. So I just wanted to talk about that if we could.
Yeah, I guess I didn't go quite as far on insurrection, just because it seemed like just so much energy. And maybe since you've actually been on the ground and at a protest, Danny, you could tell us a little bit more. But, from what I said, like, people have been cooped up for so long, and it seemed like there was just a lot of not really organization, but just anger coming out and pouring out onto the street. So that was a little bit more my thinking.
Well, yeah, I mean, I'm glad that you sort of read those excerpts. They get at the heart of what I was sort of trying to do in this article. First of all, I don't think that all insurrections are bad. I'm generally of the peaceful bent, with the exception of self-defense. And occasionally there are instances in history and probably around the world today where I would probably be a guerrilla, right, had I been in a similar situation. So I'm not a complete pacifist, but I do think that not all insurrections are bad. However, I really wanted to do 3 things with this piece, and that's a lot of things, right? But first of all, I wrote it on Monday. I had been at the protests pretty much all day and night, Saturday and Sunday, and it published Tuesday morning. I wasn't the only one. I don't want to make it like, a white savior messiah was out there right all along. But I will say that myself and several others, okay, in the kind of alternative media space were days ahead, and this does not surprise me, days ahead of the Mattis, Mullen, Dempsey crowd of, polite generals, right, who have not saved us before, who have not really spoken out before, who said the same things that are in this article, that this is not an insurrection, right, that Trump is misusing his power and escalating. It does not surprise me that they were behind the curve. And by behind the curve, I mean behind the people and the folks on the ground, because I can guarantee you that not a single one of those people, and I know they're a little older, but I saw people older than them on the streets. I can guarantee you not one of them was out in a single protest, right? Took their head outside of their retirement communities to do it. So that's kind of my first idea was, look, I think we have to be plain and clear about our language. And all of us writers fail at that sometimes, myself included. But insurrection is an important word when the implication of invoking that term and thereby invoking the act could mean the 82nd Airborne in the streets. So I think we need to be clear about what an insurrection is and what reaches that threshold. And my point was that if this is the threshold, right, the number of deaths, the number of fires, the number of looting incidents, right, if this threshold is insurrection, that low bar should really concern us, right, whether we're on the left or more libertarian, small c conservative, whatever you want to call it, I think it's concerning. The second thing that I wanted to do was point out and it was one of the reasons I've been at the protests, 4 out of the last 6 nights, is the militarization of the police, which I and many people before me have been writing about for years. I wanted to point out the systemic militarization that we are seeing in, cosmetic but real form, in the form of riot gear, khaki, drones, and sniper teams that I pointed out in my article. And then finally, I wanted to talk about character and policy being combined in the figure of Donald Trump and his administration of collaborators and lackeys. And I think most highly here of Mike Pompeo and Barr, the Attorney General. But I wanted to point out that once and for all, if this wasn't clear, this is an inflammatory and dangerous president who in a lot of ways has ceded any right to the office. Now, it's funny that I should say that, or it shouldn't be funny that I say that, but many people will consider it funny because my polite liberal friends, right, in quotes, have been very upset with me for years, ever since Trump was elected, and think I'm an apologist or I write with a MAGA hat on because I do criticize Biden, I do criticize MSNBC and the DNC. So I think there's been a misunderstanding in many cases, and maybe that's part of my own lack of clarity, that I'm somehow a Trump apologist. But those are the 3 things I wanted to do, and I hope I got some of them across. Of course, a better writer would have taken less than 2,000 words to do it.
I disagree with you on that. I think anything that big, I think people could write a whole book on those subjects. But no, it was a good read. And, we also have a fearful president, right? And I guess this gets back to my concerns and whether or not those are important or not. But I don't think I'm the only one that, that I think that there has been an attempt, or at very least a hope, to get this guy to really overreact on something. And I've got actually offspring out in these protests, so I'm also coming at it with a mother's perspective, which skews everything. So I'm just afraid that there are bad actors who want the worst to happen, and they see these protesters as pawns. I know that's not really what you wrote about, but I don't know, just to clarify myself, and I'll hand it over to Kyle.
Yeah, so I guess I saw a couple of the videos, I think you posted them on Twitter, of some of the tactics that the police were using and pulling people out of the crowd. I think they maced a young lady pretty close to you. And so I was just wondering, because you've been to occupations in Iraq and Afghanistan, how the police tactics here are comparing with that. And I guess as far as accountability too, soldier accountability compared to, what the police are facing.
These are important points. To just quickly kind of say something about Joanne's point, I've been very careful, and this will also relate to yours as well, Kyle. I've been very careful to, yes, I draw analysis from history, my own reading, but trying to focus on what's before my eyes in Kansas City and what was before my eyes in my own units, right, in Iraq and Afghanistan. So I won't pretend to speak for a broad and disparate movement, and just like I won't pretend to speak for a broad and disparate, army full of many units. However, I think that I have a little bit more insight than maybe most. So I don't speak for the movement, and I'm very careful and cautious about stating what the tactics should be, right? Specifically given my own position, my own race, a lot of reasons. However, on a personal level, I do have concerns about what are being called what is very much a minority of agitators or folks who are trying to cause the overreaction. Of course, I'm equally or more concerned about government infiltrators, false flagging some of that stuff. But I think both are real, and I think we have to be intellectually honest here and say that both are real, and be willing on a personal level, okay, because I'm not a leader of this movement, on a personal level to critique them. Now, I think that does relate to Kyle's question. So, yeah, I've put a lot of videos on Twitter and Facebook, and I think that something we should all keep in mind, self-critically as well as critical thinking when we look at other people's videos, is that even a video is imperfect and tells a part of a story. Okay, so not a lot of people have called me out on this. And I don't know, I guess I understand that, but I actually would have expected more. Even my lens can't capture everything, right? So someone might look at some of the videos that I put out and say, okay, well, you didn't show what this person did before they before the picture of the tear gas or before the picture of the pepper spray. I can tell you, to the extent that I have credibility, that everything that I have posted publicly was not warranted. The overreaction was not warranted by any or justified by anything more than, at best, water bottle throwing, and not even frozen. That doesn't mean that those things haven't been happening. I just want to clarify for anyone who's skeptical of the videos. I have others that I've chosen not to post, right? So I'm very careful about making sure that what I'm trying to say in my narrative is accurate to what's in the video, because I admit videos, not just in a postmodern way, but in a real way, are deceiving. So as for, and I'm sorry for the long intro, as for the tactics of the police, the militarized police in Kansas City, as to what I experienced in Baghdad and Afghanistan. First off, the U.S. military has an abhorrent record overseas with prisoners, with policing, with emphasis on force, especially in the early years of the Iraq and Afghan war, but not only in the early years. However, from my narrow aperture of the units that I served in and the units I commanded, I can say with certainty, and I believe that my soldiers would agree with this, we acted with more restraint and more decency, by and large, and would have been subject to more accountability, some of which would have come from me, and my soldiers knew that, would have been subject to more accountability than much of what you see on television and what I personally saw through my narrow lens. This, to me, is part of the story and is very disturbing, because when I talk about the way we treat prisoners, the way we treat, protesters or folks who were sort of surrounding our vehicles or anything like that, in many cases, particularly in the case of detainees, right, prisoners, these were actual folks who had been shooting at us, in some cases had caused casualties among our friends minutes earlier. Okay, so I'm sorry, I know that we're all supposed to talk about how it's just bad apples, and we're all supposed to caveat everything with how wonderful and dangerous the police job is, but I'm not impressed. I'm not impressed by their level of danger. I'm not impressed by their fear. I think it's real, but that is what you sign up for. In other words, you accept a degree of, danger to your own personal safety as, sort of the price or the cost of being handed a uniform and a weapon, and you have certain responsibilities. And so, saying that it seems to me, and this is my final point, that there is a culture in policing, an apologia, which has said that the primary duty of the police is to, get home safe and make sure all their friends and colleagues get home safe. I want that to be true on a personal level. I want that to be the outcome. However, that is not the primary duty, and there is a degree of risk that's associated with carrying a weapon for an abstract state, and one must accept it. And, that's my point on that, and I think it's very, very discomforting that we give the police almost more leeway than we give our soldiers when it comes to accountability.
That's a really interesting perspective. As somebody who's been really worried about and complaining loudly about the repurposing of surplus military equipment from the Pentagon out to these police forces to a ridiculous level. I recall, I forget, it was sort of a rural county or something like that, getting this. Maybe it was one of those Lento Bearcat things. I'm not sure, but they just have ridiculous equipment in places where they don't even need it. And this, I think, it may have started under Bush. I know it continued under Obama, because that's the administration that I complained about it, during that period of time. But I mean, what do they expect? What do they expect to happen when you give? I mean, just look at these cops. The cops in my town, right? We used to have white sedans with the red light on the top, and over time, they now and because of some storm damage, I just had a policeman out here yesterday, that they have these black SUVs. Their uniforms are still what they used to be, so I will say that, but that's not their riot gear, which I'm sure that our police have here in a suburban town. But just it's a menacing, fearful thing, where it used to be designed as like cars that are easy to see, that are easy to reach out to if you need help. Just the whole thing has changed since 9/11, and I guess why are we surprised that if we militarize our police, plus supposedly the training they've gotten, crowd control type training. Some of them are sent to Israel for that kind of thing. I mean, it's just a recipe for disaster, isn't it?
Oh, well, certainly. What concerns me is, of course, that we've handed the police of our even small towns with military equipment. But what even concerns me more is that for now an entire generation of young police, when you see the younger police out there, they were raised in this new culture. What we've done culturally is also hand them a militarized portfolio, right? A militarized mandate. And I think that's just as dangerous as, the riot gear, the assault rifles, the drones, and the MRAP armored vehicles. Of course, I wrote in one of my articles about a small town in like southern Indiana that hasn't had a murder since the Johnson administration has, an MRAP, right, just rolling around the streets, or at least is available if they need it. So this is all very disturbing. And I'll just give you one quick vignette as like sort of the devil's advocate that's often played to this. I was on the ground in Kansas City I believe on Tuesday. It was the quietest night so far. And a reporter from an NPR affiliate, wearing the ball cap and all, of course, sought me out, right? I just watched him scanning the crowd, and he seeks me out, right? Not a young black person, not that those are the only people you should talk to, but came right to me, laser focused. Why? Well, I have a veteran's shirt on, right? I look a certain way. I've got, I'm even wearing my dog tags for the first time in years, probably as some sort of defense mechanism selfishly, but comes up to me and asks me some questions, and I pointed out the militarized police and why that concerned me, and I pointed to some of the gear and explained some things to him. And as devil's advocate, and he was very, very, but you could tell he believed this too. He wasn't just playing devil's advocate. He was saying, well, what if, don't you want the snipers on the roof over there that I was pointing to? Because, if there are, sort of like vigilantes or anything, rolling out with assault rifles to attack this crowd, don't you want that support? And then, of course, the point's not completely wrong. And I tried to nod towards an understanding that there is an element, I don't think it's the primary one, but an element of protecting the crowd. But then I pointed out that we are here because of an incident, one of, obviously countless number, that was a ramification of the systemic militarization of police, and that we are here to protest. In other words, I said, we cannot just focus on the cosmetic, and we cannot, we can't quibble about the importance of protecting this crowd without mentioning two things. Number one, that, like I've said, we've like militarized this entire culture and sort of tactics of policing in America, which has had really nefarious outgrowths, as they always do in history. And then also that part of the reason that we need to be scared, and I said this to him, of the potential vigilantes, or, the MAGA goons, or whatever you want to call them, is because we have a president who's like directly calling them out, right, in not so veiled ways. And so, I think these are the broader points, and we cannot lose sight of the systemic things that we are protesting. And my final issue on this that I told him, and I've written a few times in social media and in articles, is while I don't speak for the movement and have no right to, I am of the opinion that it is important that we be out there every day. And it's one of the reasons I've used just about every free non-kid, non-writing moment to be there of late, is because it's important not to cede the narrative. And that means cede the narrative either to the reflexive law and order, quote unquote, crowd, or to, those who might legitimately be trying to, goad the president into violence, or, sort of, I hate to say hijack, but, just, use this as an opportunism for violence. I think we cannot cede the narrative to either.
Right. And I guess that one other thing I should mention is that this always happens. So I'm trying to keep in perspective that whenever there's a big protest, there's always either it's a fringe movement who, comes into it and gets on camera and tries to give the impression that they have, such support. And there are always people trying to exploit it. So I'm not trying to say that this is anything new. And in the past, and hopefully will be the case with this one too, the underlying purpose and the passionate feelings about the injustice that needs to be fixed will come through, and we'll win in this, we hope. So I don't want to sort of overemphasize the co-opted nature of it.
Yeah, if I could just, I'm sure Kyle wants to jump in as well. If I could just say one thing about that before I lose the thought. I don't think that it's inappropriate for you to have these concerns, and I have them too. So that's like, first of all, I didn't think you were overreacting. And, the second point here is the historical one, that when you have largely organic and unplanned to enormous extent mass gatherings in the interest of any movement that is far-flung and understood differently for each of the individual protesters, there is going to be a messy nature to it, right? What Donald Rumsfeld very callously said about looting in Iraq, that democracy is messy. Well, Rumsfeld's an idiot and was wrong about every foreign policy issue in his entire career, but he's not completely wrong about democracy, right? And so what's been remarkable to me, in a sense, has been at least in Kansas City and in other cities from what I've read, overall a remarkable level of discipline, given how random, right, and unplanned much of this is, and the disparate nature and the difficulty to control, right? These aren't foot soldiers in a movement, no matter what the rhetoric says. And so I think we have to keep in mind this. And the final issue here, and I think the kids call them memes, and I just like to play curmudgeon, I know what they are, but the meme game is dangerously misleading. One of the most famous ones that's rolling around, I guess, on the right generally, although even among some apologists, so-called liberals, is this meme where on the top is a picture of King with arms interlocked on the Selma Bridge March peacefully, and then below, you insert whatever picture of looting is dug up on the internet, right? And one says, this is how you protest, and this is not protest, or whatever. It's been peddled by my own family. What is, I think, very, very dangerous about this, and beyond symbolic, is that both pictures are a false attempt at encapsulation of, again, very disparate, halting, and nonlinear movements and complex movements. So neither King, who was actually rather radical, especially late in his career's rhetoric, nor the civil rights movement in general was ever one thing. And it was never always peaceful, right? No movement really in history has been only one thing, any independence movement or sort of rebellion. And so it mischaracterizes what civil rights was. And then taking that mischaracterization, it lays a judgment on this movement through, in some ways, an even worse attempt at encapsulation by stating that the looters represent the cause. And, I saw an article by Tucker Carlson that really, played on this to extremists because it's, his rhetoric. But, I think that's very dangerous. It's almost misleading. If I wasn't so ironclad and non-gray on free speech, I'd almost say we'd be better off if we just deleted the meme game for a few months. But, it's used very dangerously is my point.
No, I think that's a really good point because there's enough going on right now in the U.S. With protests in all these different cities where people could find 5 or 10 examples of whatever they're looking for, either looters or especially on the right, they're looking for young black men attacking white people, as kind of proof that we need the police. Or on the other side, they point to some picture of a cop clubbing somebody, and that's kind of, and so everything really is the meme game. I think really does hurt having any kind of nuanced or bigger discussion. So that's a really great point. I've watched more feeds and I haven't actually attended a protest, but it seems that there's some places I'm looking at where the protesters are kind of allowed to just do their thing, and there's really not a big cop presence, and they're doing more sit-in type things and 10-minute or 9 minutes of silence or whatever. And then there's cities where the cops are lined up in this full riot gear, and it seems that's where the protesters are often meeting them head on. And I've noticed a lot of the cops wearing face shields. I'm not sure if that's just a COVID measure or if it's some new riot gear thing. But at least on video, it makes it impossible to actually see the cop's face most of the time. And I'm wondering if it's having a really dehumanizing impact from the protesters' view on the police officers, and if that's possibly adding to what's making things worse, especially because it seems that so often there is some at least smaller aggression by the police that kicks off bigger rioting or, actions by the protesters, where it may not be like blatant, clubbing some lady in the head, but maybe taking out like a protester who's clearly very vocal and just plucking him out of the crowd and arresting him. See that a lot, and then that leads to like more confrontation. So I was just wondering if especially with the face shield gear, if you've noticed any of that at all.
Two very important points. The first one is the broader one, which is about what is the effect of, sort of intransigent and visible police presence on the ground. Again, I will speak to Kansas City, although I think that it is instructive from reading in several other cities. On Saturday and Sunday were the second and first largest protests that I saw, respectively. The police were raring to go. They came equipped for war. They were protecting property on the affluent shopping district of the plaza, of course, and they were right up in the face of the crowd. And then that, of course, caused the counter reaction. And one could, of course, argue chicken or egg. But what I know is that while in Kansas City, the violence and looting was even admitted by the mayor to be relatively mild, comparatively, those were the nights when the most of that happened, right? And so it is difficult to define causality, but it seemed to me that there was more militants in the crowd when there were police in their face. And the reason I can say that is to contrast it with Wednesday, partly because the mayor and police marched with the crowd, right? And sort of, you can call it a stunt or you can call it a great thing. It's maybe somewhere in the middle. The police on Wednesday, which was, I would say, the third largest crowd, so it's very sizable, they really stayed away. And they even let the marchers ad hoc, unplanned, like go into like another business district, and we marched all around, and the police showed a degree of restraint. And the crowd, so if the point is to protect like civilian cars from being burned and shops from being destroyed, and that's why they needed that militarized presence, then one would expect that on Wednesday, with a very large crowd, there would have been an enormous amount of damage, because we walked through civilian neighborhoods and other business districts with the cops really at a far distance, and there was none that I saw, right? And even the report the next morning in Kansas City media indicated that there was very minimal arrests and probably the lowest violence yet. So that's just one kind of vignette and an anecdote, but it's important. Now, the face shields matter, right? I'm not a believer that counterinsurgency as a tactic can substitute for real strategy or understanding that, militarized invasion and occupation and forcing your way on another country is itself just, not ethical. But we were taught as soldiers, right, on the mid-level, that you can't do counterinsurgency, which in some ways is like a more militarized form of community policing, if you read the manuals, although they're flawed. We were told you can't do counterinsurgency from the inside of a MRAP or the inside of a Humvee or the inside of a tank. And we were always encouraged, especially once Petraeus came to power, and I am not a fan of Petraeus, but we were encouraged by his ilk to get out in the communities and walk around. And then in Afghanistan, we were encouraged, and I did, to go live in the village, right, with like local militia and stuff. And, so the idea was to get with the people. On the cosmetic but important level, the eyes mattered a lot. And we were told that both in Iraqi and in Afghan culture, it was very important that the people you were talking to, especially like leaders and, tribal leaders and, sheikhs and stuff, that they'd be able to look you in the eyes and that you'd be able to kind of come down to their level in order to like get them to speak openly. So one of the things that we were told to do, even at risk to ourselves to some degree, because there really were snipers and there really were bombs right in the street. We really were targeted on a level these cops can't imagine. We were told to take off our sunglasses, right, which is the closest, they were ballistic glasses, the closest thing to these shields, although not as strong. And we were told in some cases, especially as officers, to take off our vests, and kind of look normal and interact with these people. And, we had security measures in place from our soldiers in the cordon, but, there was some limited risk. And so my point is, again, we see the police, more insecure, more reflexively law and order than many of our soldiers are coached, trained, and ordered to be in real war zones where, hundreds of thousands of people have died at a minimum.
Yeah, it's funny because I have a question in here, suggestion of just sort of how to draw the parallels between the kind of work that you did overseas. And I heard someone else bring up, the ratio of police to citizens or protesters, if this really spun out of control. And so, of course, this is a controversial issue in Iraq about not having enough soldiers for an occupation or pacification operation. But I was just wondering, like, have you given that any thought as to, these ratios and what you're seeing and comparing to your overseas missions? Like, you have any thoughts on that? I could just cut this out if it doesn't make any sense, but it just seemed like somebody brought up, they're like, these cops don't stand a chance. They even in New York, they got like 38,000 officer police and 9 million citizens. Not that all of them are out on the street, but the numbers, I just wonder where this is going to go.
No, I mean, yeah, absolutely. This is an important question. And there are two aspects to it. So the first one is sort of like the empirical and the statistical, and the second one is one about appropriateness of the analogy. And so to begin with, if I'm remembering correctly, classic counterinsurgency doctrine, again, which is largely based on cherry-picked poor historical examples, but classic French, British, and now co-opted American counterinsurgency doctrine in the FM Field Manual 3-24 is that I believe one soldier, right, one occupier, one counterinsurgent, to put it nicely, per 50 people in the population is the necessary ratio. This became a very interesting paradox during the Petraeus McChrystal surge years, right? Whether it was the 07 Iraq surge or the 09 through, like 11 or 12 Afghan surge. Because the tool at our disposal, right, going to war with the military you have rather than one you want, as Rumsfeld so cheekily and callously put it, the military we had, the size of it, which is already fairly large, would not have been able to implement what they said was the necessary counterinsurgency math, the necessary ratio, to conduct the wars to victory in either Iraq or Afghanistan. We would have had to move to a draft to do that. And of course, the paradox is that everyone knew, including Republican neoconservatives, that A, the American people would never put up with a draft, and there would be a massive anti-war movement if we attempted it, and B, that even the most like neo of the neoconservatives never really seriously considered it politically. So there was already that paradox. And it does apply to policing in terms of the impossibility, right, given budgets and all that, of maintaining that level of, ratio. But I do think that there's a degree of inappropriateness to the analogy. Not that you're trying to say that, but I think it's a mistake to characterize what the police need to be doing or properly ought to be doing in our cities, even in time of mass protest. I think it is very, very dangerous to equate that with counterinsurgency and then apply the equivalent, if flawed, math. This is not the duty or the role or the responsibility of policing. And of course, most of the consensus, to the extent that that ever exists in scholarship, the experts who are, so hated now, right, as elites, the broad consensus is that, the community policing model is the most effective, despite what the Giulianis of the world say. I think Giuliani said that there would never be a riot, right? It would have been impossible for there to be a riot when I was mayor because I was such a badass, right? And then I was like, I don't know. I remember some pretty serious protests on my own tiny, 500,000 people, but my own tiny borough of Staten Island when the cops choked Ernest Sayon to death in 1994 in the Park Hill Projects, where famously the Wu-Tang Clan rap group is from. I remember that well. One of my uncles was on site as a cop, so there was some pretty. So he's a liar, first of all, but. The point is that I think we should be very cautious and almost never apply counterinsurgency to the police, except in the way you are, which is to raise questions about, the efficacy of it or the appropriateness of it.
Yeah, and I guess my concern is of something that you talked about before, sort of I don't think I understand the mission of the police forces in our country anymore. And when I see all this military equipment, now I know some of that is just like somebody's making money off of it somewhere, although I believe it's provided for free. But I know that they get grants from Homeland Security, and you know that somebody's grifting off of some of that, and the whole macho nature of that business. But it does seem like, and particularly with the kind of training, the sort of crowd control training, crowd control that's just, I think it is along the lines with counterinsurgency or pacification. So I don't even know if our cops, I don't know if they really even understand their mission. And I don't want to take up too much time with that, but I appreciate that answer. And Kyle, I'm drowning you out, so why don't you jump in?
No, I mean, I was just going to say, I think, especially from my perspective and Joanne's perspective, where we're huge observers of American foreign policy, but, have never served and I'm pretty sure, Joanne, I don't know about any of your secret past trips to Afghanistan, but I don't think either of us have ever been there. But when we watch a lot of video and, we're just very familiar, we really study the wars and the U.S. occupations. And then when you see that, some of the cops standing around and, even going as far as some of the, tactics they're using at times with how frequently they're using tear gas and, seeming just, I guess at the more like I've seen the IDF at than American soldiers, but that's why I think occupation, and that's why the parallels immediately come to mind, is because that's in a lot of ways what this looks like right now. Especially when you have some of these photographs with the contrast of almost all white officers behind riot shields, and I guess they're dressed in black and not fatigues, and soldiers don't always carry riot shields, although some of them I am seeing, carrying large automatic weapons. It just visually it looks the same, and it's a huge problem. It's very scary.
No, it's extraordinarily scary. So it isn't inappropriate to mention, the obviously counterinsurgency tactics and occupation tactics, because we are seeing it. When I say it's inappropriate, I mean that I don't want it to be the case, by and large, but it is. But it's our reality. It's our lived reality. I'm far from a victim. I'm far from someone who's suffered even remotely as much as other protesters. But forgive my privilege, probably hidden behind some of that idea of like I'm a veteran, so I'm special, even though I try to eschew that. I did not expect, even a few years ago, that I would be tear gassed by my own government ever again, except for when we did it in training when I was a 17-year-old. Mother signed me into the Army, active duty, but technically cadet at West Point. But I was, right? And I was in the midst of it. And I can tell you that in the park that they told us to move to, because they had criminalized space on the curb and in the street arbitrarily and haltingly, right? Constantly changing what space was militarized and disallowed. It was a profound thing to see. There were children in the crowd. So there is this reflexive move to force. The equipment does matter again. We were told, this NPR reporter had brought up that the main purpose perhaps of these police, or key purpose, was to protect us from, vigilantes or whatever. And
Terrorists.
I think you're going to see more of that, by the way, if the president keeps it up. But, well, then why did they have these flex cuffs and zip ties? Dozens of them. Many of these officers had dozens of them kind of looped, sort of look aggressively by its very nature onto their uniforms. That's not to stop the assault rifle wielding, vigilante. That's to snatch protesters up and arrest the crowd. We carried those, obviously, in Iraq and Afghanistan to detain prisoners, most of whom were armed, right, and just attacking us. My point is, I have a lot of friends in this movement. I was the 715th person, finally, when I got around to it today. I've been publicizing it. I was sort of like humbled to be appointed as one of the main spokesmen for About Face and Veterans for Peace, the two organizations that are linked in this stand-down order we've put out to the National Guard. And, of course, it'll apply to any active duty troops activated. where we encourage them not to commit violence against their own people, and if anything, to join us. But I have a lot of friends in this movement who are out in the streets every day, and we have like a thread among us who are actual official organizers who we check in on each other every day. And I can tell you, not to personalize this too much, that broadly there is like massive PTSD flashbacks being brought to the surface for a lot of us veterans who are experiencing Kandahar in Kansas City or Baghdad in Baltimore, right? If you take my meaning, every day, because it is actually extraordinary, the parallels, and it's damaging. And so we who have seen it before are like really, really affected by it. But I also imagine it's in some ways even more terrifying to those who expected something different and have not experienced it in an American city, although many of our poorer communities of color have been experiencing it for a while.
I know we have to wrap up pretty soon because Dan, he's under high demand, being on the ground, all of his experience. You can understand why. But maybe we should bring it back around to what's going on in Washington from what we can see, and the reactions of retired generals going up against other generals, these kind of things. I don't know if I've seen this before. Maybe I did in the Iraq War. I also wanted to mention, Danny, that, one of my kids is on the ground there in DC, and this scares me, he agrees with you that he saw a fervor. He was specifically referring to the day that Trump gave the speech, that there was they charged the protesters in Lafayette, and he basically said the protest that was there in no way justified the effing cavalry charge that came at them. And he also said that he thought they were loving it. So, and anyway, I'll turn it over to you guys just to throw those topics out there. But what I'm seeing, I'm worried about the people who are people who are around the White House. I think that they may be treated entirely differently than protesters in other parts. It's a particularly dangerous area. I think, they used helicopters. I mean, that was crazy. And I just don't know. I think anything goes in that area. It's going to be very dangerous. If there is that kind of lust to lash out against these protesters, that's just really bad. But I guess I'm really conflicted when I see these generals pushing back against it. That gives me some comfort. Not that I am fond of those generals or think they've done good things in the past, but I'm glad that there is pushback, and it seems to be working.
Yeah, I do think that it's very difficult to predict which cities are going to flare up. I mean, in some ways, it has not followed the model one would completely expect. But I agree that if I was in the betting game, if we're going to see something truly abhorrent in terms of a violent overreaction from police or National Guard, I wouldn't be surprised if it's in the vicinity of the White House in D.C. I have not made a recent career of making everything about this president, again, much to the chagrin of many liberals. But I do think that we have to remember that character does count. It's not everything. Policy is important, but character does count. And we are dealing with a president who is driven foremost by his insecurities. Now, those insecurities may manifest as hyper masculinity and chauvinism and all of this, as I think most of his life has, right? But what's scary about that is that when one is driven by such profound, deep-seated insecurity, overreaction becomes very possible, because he does tend, we notice, to see everything as a personal slight. And so the protesters before the White House were a personal challenge in his mind. And so he's also his character is such that he's not built for de-escalation. He's not built for cooler heads prevailing and de-escalating and kind of, keeping things in a broader sort of package. And so because he personalizes, I wouldn't be surprised if that's where we see a bloodbath, if there is to be one, whether that be from the government's agents or from, the deep suburb MAGA crowd, right, that he might call out in Virginia or parts of Maryland. So this does concern me. I think we must not over sort of sanctify, and I know you're not doing this. We should not canonize and put all our weight or hope in these generals. I do think that as much as I've written hit pieces in many cases, although based in evidence, on almost every single one of the generals who spoke now, I mean, I've written, it was hard to actually post some of their statements with even a little bit of a positive inflection, knowing that someone could easily Google my name and pull up 4 articles that I just devastate these guys. And I look like a hypocrite. So I always had to caveat it. But, look, they were latecomers to the game, but they're here now. I think it's important that we recognize that there is something interesting, valuable about their statements, if only because they've been so coy and overly cautious so far. But it is also important that we keep in mind that they were late to the game and that they were unwilling to speak out against illegal and unethical and unwinnable wars that ultimately not only killed hundreds of thousands of civilians who matter most, but also their own soldiers who they purport to love. Mattis, we must remember, resigned largely because he didn't agree that Trump should pull out of Afghanistan and Syria. Not that Trump was even really doing that, but even when he talked about it, that was, if you read his resignation letter, that's the breaking point for Mattis. So this is not a man of great, ethical principle on a lot of levels. However, that doesn't mean that what he and, Mullen, and I think I saw Allen on TV last night, and even Dempsey, who I admit I have a soft spot for. I have I don't love the generals, but I have a soft spot for Dempsey. But that's mainly because he performs Irish limericks on top of tables after a few beers at parties, and because he taught literature at West Point, so he's got an intellectual bent. But the point about Dempsey though is that he's never really spoken out, and the only time he ever did speak out was to write a rejoinder, actually lambasted his fellow generals for getting involved in politics, especially in 2016 election. So he's been, and I've actually criticized him for being too cautious about that, for telling the generals not to weigh in. So for him to speak out, I think was even more profound. But yeah, I think we just need to temper that with the realization that these are flawed messengers, but that doesn't mean that they should be completely dismissed either. And that's probably going to upset some people on the far left or the far libertarian right or whatever you want to call it. But I think we need to be pretty measured about this.
I guess one thing I'll say, I feel like these generals are kind of phonies. As you point out, that they're guilty of, waging our foreign policy and occupying places. So I think a lot of people are going to find ways to dismiss them. But I think that's a lot harder when it comes from veterans who, actually served like yourself. And I know when it comes to war issues, Scott Horton is constantly telling me, how important your voice is, in particular, in the movement to try to end these wars. And I think the same goes for this as well, especially, as you say, you're going down there, you have a veteran shirt on. I think, you're the kind of person that a cop would more naturally respect than maybe, a young black woman who's, trying to explain their point. So I think, again, you have a very important perspective. And do you have any idea, are other, just formerly enlisted vets kind of where you're at on this, or are, what I'm sure it's a mixed bag, it's a wide group, but overall, do you have any sense of that?
Oh, definitely. There are just that I know of personally, and many I know quite personally. There's hundreds of us who are in the streets, and there's more that are sort of supporting what's going on in the streets. I have both anecdotal and sort of real, empirical evidence for that. On the anecdotal side, is that, like I said, I check in with dozens of other members of Veterans for Peace, or more specifically, about-face Veterans Against the War every day. And everyone, we say when we go in and when we get out, and we help with bail, and there's all kinds of support networks. That's one part. And most of them are enlisted. I think I'm the highest ranking member of About-Face, I believe, or at least I was. So it is mostly enlisted. However, I must admit that, there are soldiers of mine who I love and respect who have utterly turned on me. Right, because they are very much in the Trump camp, very much in all the protesters are aiding and abetting or actual terrorists, if nothing else. So veterans are not a monolith, just like communism wasn't a monolith, and not very little is. And I'm skeptical of isms, but I will say that something is afoot within the active duty military as well as the veteran community. I'm going to give a conservative estimate to be safe in case I'm ever called to footnote it with evidentiary emails. I've received in just the last week somewhere in the range of 3 to 4 dozen, that's very conservative, emails from mostly strangers who are on active duty asking for advice, which I don't really give because I think that'd be inappropriate since the risk is theirs, but asking for advice and expressing an ethical professional dilemma, a crisis inside themselves for feeling that they to support the protesters, they could never police them, and that they think that the president is really off the rails. I get those sorts of emails often, but never in this volume. And so something is afoot. And by the way, at least half a dozen of them are my former students at West Point. Half of those are in Afghanistan right now, or Syria or elsewhere. So these are not Antifa paid members or Putin apologists or un-American kids, right? Or some older. This is important. And I'll just end with this. I mean, on this point at least, there are few of them and there are many of us. And that's a platitude we hear a lot. But the power of the few is the foot soldier. And the foot soldier runs the gamut from, security guard to Delta Force. But really, it's the militarized police and the actual military. The profound moment that is that they're most afraid of, they being, I guess, I don't know what you want to call them, the powers that be, the oligarchs, depending on your political inflection. But the powerful people atop our government at the local and the national level are most afraid of a soldier's revolt. That doesn't necessarily have to mean a coup or an armed revolt, but even just a refusal to fire or a refusal to deploy to the streets is what they fear most. It is no accident that dissent will usually be allowed or accepted or blacked out at the very least, but not really attacked, so long as it avoids sort of the sacred cow. So long as it avoids the third rail. And the third rail in this instance is encouragement of soldiers to dissent or refuse. I'm a lapsed Catholic, but also a sort of fan, although I'm not religious, of like liberation theology in South America and the Catholic Church. And so I say that because it is worth noting that the Archbishop of El Salvador during the right-wing sort of junta there and the death squads was allowed, unhappily, they were very angry with him, but was allowed to dissent for 3 years from 1977 to 1980 against the regime and against the army. But the day after he gave a sermon calling on the soldiers as Catholics, ordering, right, even at the end, as Catholics, to refuse to shoot their fellow peasants, it was on his own altar or on the altar of a church hospital that he was assassinated the next day. So I causation is always difficult, but there's a lot of evidence that I've read that was the breaking point. So it is very dangerous to do what About Face Veterans Against the War, one of the organizations I belong to, has done, which is to put out this stand down letter. It's encouragement, not ordering, of course. But I will tell you that I have read just a little bit of the, quote, fan mail that we've received in response. And some of it has literally said, you guys are terrorists. And one of it said that I just sent your letter to the Department of Justice. Now, I don't suspect anything will happen with that, but it points to the fact that the thing that is most feared by powerful security folks is that the foot soldiers, be they police or soldiers, will refuse. And we saw that in Vietnam, and that started to happen. And it's no accident that that's when Nixon ended the draft and thought he could head this off with a volunteer force. And it's been largely successful so far, but we're seeing rumblings.
Perfect way to wrap things up, Dan. You have a book that is available for pre-order, Patriotic, Dissent, America in the Age of Endless War. So everybody go out and get that. And please tell everybody where to find you and how to support your work.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. So Patriotic Dissent comes out, I believe, September 9th. It's with Heyday Books, I should mention, out of Berkeley. Available for pre-order now, Amazon and elsewhere. I run a podcast weekly known as Fortress on a Hill, fortressonahill.com, with fellow veterans. We've had some great guests recently, and then you can check out all my work at skepticalvet.com, which is where all my media and columns appear, as well as, of course, my weekly column where I'm also a contributing editor, which is antiwar.com, which you guys are very familiar with. And thank you for the opportunity to do that. There's a lot to be said, and you'll find me both in print and in the streets over the next who knows how long.
Thank you, Danny.
Thanks, Danny.